Jennifer Campbell, creator and host of the Systemic Leadership Summit. Welcome to this session. And in this session, we will talk about leading change and the importance of a mindful stance and deep systemic perception within a leader. My guest has extensive experience in leading change in the corporate world as a leader, an entrepreneur, and a coach. Today, she will share her insights about the balance between the outer and the inner game of making change leadership a success, and her name is Deborah Rowland. Deborah brings a unique combination of experience, insight, and research to the leadership of change. She has personally led change in major global organizations, including Shell, Gucci Group, BBC Worldwide, and PepsiCo Holding, both Group HR and VP of Organizational and Management Development roles. She also founded and grew a consulting firm that pioneered research in the field, and she acts as change coach to the executive boards of major corporations. Clients have included De Beers, Dell Computers, RWE, Santander, Diageo, GlaxoSmithKline, Kraft Foods, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Prudential, Rolls-Royce Holdings, Royal Dutch Shell, Unilever, and the Church of England. She is also a member of the Strategic Investment Board of the Church of England. Deborah's research into the leadership of change has been widely published in academic journals and was accepted as a paper at the 2016 Academy of Management Conference and the 2019 European Academy of Management. She enjoys speaking at conferences on the subject of change and its leadership. Deborah has a double degree in archaeology and anthropology from Cambridge University, which continues to inform her work. And she's the co-author of the book, Sustaining Change, Leadership That Works. Deborah's latest book, Still Moving, How to Lead Mindful Change, is based on her 2015 groundbreaking research into the realities of leading change. And today she's here with us in the Systemic Leadership Summit. A very warm welcome to you, Deborah. Thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure.
And so let's start off our conversation. And I really want to start where it started for you, and that is with your background in archaeology and anthropology, which I find a very interesting combination. So how did these studies inform you about dealing with change back then, and how did they inform you still today?
That's a great question. Thank you, Jennifer, to kick us off there. Now, I remember when I left university wondering, what on earth does a degree in archaeology and anthropology, what skills do you pick up from that?
Yeah.
I think the two primary responses to that. Number one is they are both about seeing systems. Say, whether that's back in time, the cultures of the past, or in anthropology, looking at societies today, they give you an intense ability to look at the interrelationship between culture, religion, family systems, productivity, economics, religion, whatever that might be. So I think it gives you the capacity to be able to not just see systems, but appreciate them.
Yeah.
And I think any great change leader is, you don't look at your system and think, oh my goodness me, if only it could be different. Particularly with anthropology, the mindset beneath it is acknowledgement and respect for the cultural context.
Yeah.
So I do believe it's developed a systemic awareness, but secondly also a capacity to empathize with whatever behavior I see. I seek to understand rather than judge. I'm not saying I'm perfect at that. But I believe that's what those two disciplines taught me.
Thank you for the introduction, and what I find so fascinating is that the systemic perspective coming from both the historical way of looking at people and how they interact and how they work and how they build their civilizations, which is my connotation with archaeology. And then looking at society now from the anthropological perspective that you have, and that build the systemic sense in you, and to understand behavior also. And so could you share with us more how you brought that into your change leadership? You've led change in big corporations, and there were so many different change situations that you dealt with. So what are some of the most important change leadership lessons that you learned from that?
Okay, well, it's great to make the connection, I guess, between that and the practical work I've done in the field. As anthropologists, we talk about the field.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you mentioned archaeology having a profound relationship with time.
Yeah.
And I remember when I both joined PepsiCo and then also Shell, to have a real appreciation of what's come before me.
Mm-hmm.
And great change leaders don't just start with an ambition, I'm going to come in and I've got my own views, but they really find out who has gone before me, what's gone before me,
Mm-hmm.
and to appreciate that all, and to find out the present always has a residue from the past.
Yeah.
So the dynamics that you're seeing in the present situation are an echo maybe of something that's happened in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And until you map the timeline, so I'm used now, whether that was in my roles or even with my work right now, is just getting leaders to go back in time to map all of the key events that have led up to today.
Yeah.
And to fully acknowledge and appreciate. And even if there were upsets or, well, that change didn't go that well, did it? To acknowledge, well, what did we learn from that?
Mm-hmm.
So I do think starting with time and the past is important,
Yeah.
but also to the future. What I loved about working at Shell in particular was the work with scenarios. So
Right.
Shell is extraordinarily well known for their work on scenarios. And obviously, if you are trying to predict oil price movements or putting in a new refinery, which could take 10 to 20 years cashback analysis. But the scenarios group at Shell, I was fascinated by. And in fact, in the change team, we work closely alongside the change group. Because with scenarios work, you're trying to map possible futures and also probable futures. And of course, when you're leading change, you haven't just got to look back at the past, acknowledge what's here now, but to have a real capacity to anticipate. So that for me gave me an enormous grounding in the capacity to work with futures. And particularly now, in today's more disruptive world, I was at Shell 25 years ago.
Yeah.
I think scenarios now are almost, you can only do 1 5-year scenarios. At Shell in those days, we did 20, 30-year scenarios.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that really helped me. And I also learned back to anthropology, to appreciate the cultural differences as well.
Mm-hmm.
Pepsi and Shell were very, very different organizations. And I learned that you lead change in Pepsi through a lot of action, very entrepreneurial, fast-moving organization. Yeah. At Shell, you lead change more through analysis, good planning.
Yeah.
So another big lesson I learned from moving between those two organizations is never lead change in the same way in every context.
Yeah.
So you have to work within the existing culture, mm-hmm. and to learn how to be able to adapt that from where it starts rather than where you'd like it to be.
Right, right. So thank you for that. So what I gather from that is that the aspects of time from past to now to future, and the aspect of culture and context are key to the biggest change leadership lessons learned for you, and how you learned how to be really effective at leading change, and how that's different in different contexts and different organizations. And so speaking of difference, what I find intriguing is that you've led change while fulfilling different roles. So some of the roles were to be a leader, like the vice president, for example, within the organization, but you also work as a coach to executive boards. And you were also an entrepreneur when you founded and led your consulting firm. So there's all these different roles. And what I'm curious about is, do you see any difference between the roles you fulfill and how to make change leadership a success?
That's, again, a super question. And what you have drawn my attention to now, Jennifer, is the importance of your place in a system.
Yeah.
And you have to, it's not just about you as an individual. And as we know through work in structural and systemic constellations, I'm sure a lot of the people tuning into this summit know about one of the 4 orders that Bert Hellinger talked about is place.
Mm-hmm.
And to acknowledge that place, in a way, is bigger than the individual in corporations.
Yeah.
So your role holds requirements.
Yeah.
And as an individual, you have to sort of work from that role and how it interacts with other people.
Mm-hmm.
So I think as a general thing, to acknowledge place is really important. For me, the key difference between being in as an executive or being more in what I would call the liminal space as a coach
Mm-hmm.
is the notion of accountability. You know, what is your head on the block for? So that always sort of, you know, differs, I think, your response to what you have to do.
Yeah.
I felt the courage when I was an executive leader, for example, at BBC Worldwide leading change. What I really learned when you're in the executive role is the courage it takes to do something different and new. If you're coming from the outside, that's sort of expected as you as the coach.
Yeah.
But to be able to, as a leader, to have what I call detached intimacy with the system.
Mm-hmm.
If you're an executive, you get a lot of projection from the organization, and it's very easy to get swept up in it.
Yeah.
So the capacity to step back when you're in the organization, to take time out. I've worked with a lot of executives who use plane rides to do some journaling, to try and actually step back out of your role and to see what's really going on. And that I found then gave me the courage to take some key decisions that impacted people. So I think courage and getting detachment is key when you're in the executive role.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you are in an advisory role, it's very different. And I enjoy being in a criminal space.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, the key thing that you do when you're on that boundary role is to what I call, can you model what is missing from the client system?
Ah, okay. So can you model what's missing from the client system? Now, that's a different question than why am I here and what's my role? It's similar, but that's just what's popping up for me now. So can I model what's missing in the system? Interesting.
Yes, because you're in a way you're there to act as a signal or a point of getting the client system used to working in a different way.
Yeah.
So for example, I've been working in a client system recently where straight talking is very hard and difficult to do. Now, there's all kinds of issues around psychological safety in the culture.
Yeah.
And once that's there, it's very easy for me to then slip into that too, to be very nice and polite and not rock the boat. And I will purposely say to try and talk straight in that system.
Yeah.
To model that feels very, very important. So that for me is one of the key roles that you play if you're on the coaching role.
Yeah.
I guess it's sort of like holding up the mirror.
Yeah.
The other thing I think when you're in the coaching role is to really be in tune with, I know we're going to go on to examining still moving later, but to be very much in tune with what is going on inside you.
Mm-hmm.
What are you picking up? Is it frustration with the system, boredom, tiredness, joy, love, unrequited passion, whatever that might be?
Mm-hmm.
And if it feels a bit odd to you, then it probably doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the system in some way.
Mm-hmm.
So I do find that the clients might project unconscious dynamics onto you. And so it's so important when we do our practitioner training, if you're a change coach, to really attend to the thoughts and the feelings and all the sensations that are coming up in you.
Yeah.
And can you make that available to the client? Because often a consultant feels that I've got to be very, sort of polite or very professional here. And I'm feeling all of this, but I dare not say this.
Yeah.
So there's a different kind of courage if you're in the external space, which is the courage to speak about what's going on for you and to use that service of the dynamics that the client might be holding.
Right. And I'm so glad that you're speaking to this because when we look at who are attending this summit, then there's people who hold both of these roles, and we haven't even gone into the entrepreneurial role again, which is also different again. But it can also open up a discussion between executives and their coaches and consultants about how they shape their collaboration in order to serve the system or serve the purpose for which the consultants are there to help the executives. And so there's also a suggestion in there for leaders to open up to see, what am I projecting onto external parties, external people who are trying to help us to develop the system, and am I aware of that? So that's what I'm picking up on also, in terms of what are the roles to fill or to play, as you named it, and how do they interact also. So very fascinating. And then there is the third role of the entrepreneur, which you founded your own consulting firm. And is that again different from the executive role for you, or not?
Yes, it's nothing beats going out alone and doing your own thing. I know you're an entrepreneur yourself, Jennifer. I think the thing about entrepreneurs is you have an idea. You have an idea that you think is needed in the market that is maybe lacking at the moment.
Yeah.
So I think entrepreneurs have a founding idea or principle. My founding idea when I set up my own organizations was about bringing the more effortless leadership of change to the world.
Yeah.
So I love my corporate roles. Coaching was fantastic, but I wanted to do more than just be an independent coach. I wanted to found a movement.
Yeah.
A sort of a network of practitioners who have a passion for bringing the more responsible leadership of change.
Yeah.
And that led me on to my research, because I think it's great to have an idea and a sense of mission, but entrepreneurs as well, you need to have what I call proof of concept. So you might have an idea, but how do you know it's going to work? How do you know there's a market for it?
Yeah.
So I think the 3 rounds of research I've done over the last 20 years as an entrepreneur gave me an awful lot of insight into what was needed out there, and data and analytics that enabled the growth. I've never really had a business plan, by the way. I don't know whether good entrepreneurs should or shouldn't have a business plan, but I think a combination of the founding idea for me that the world needed, then actually testing that through the research. And I also find that to be an entrepreneur, it needs to be what I call Velcro. It needs to have people wanting to stick to it, right?
Yeah.
And I've got an amazing group of folk that I work with who have all joined, this so-called movement. And you have to take risks. The risks I put into my research, what I invested in it. I had no idea whether or not I was going to find anything in the research that would have any compelling interest to the world. But I took a punt. I thought, well, why not? I'm going to put something at stake here and have a go.
Yeah.
I also think as an entrepreneur, I try to work with minimal bureaucracy, or, in a sense, you're trying to set up a movement that might allow fresh expression of new things in the world. I can't say I'm great as an entrepreneur. I'm not saying I'm great. And I've had lots of feedback on it as well.
Yeah.
But there is a sense of excitement around what I and my colleagues do. So I think that's a bit of a sign of some kind of success anyway.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing that. What's so interesting is that as an entrepreneur, what you're actually doing is you're taking a seed and you're building your own system. And you're hoping that the context of the market or clients or companies or anyone you're doing, in your case, the research for, that it will stick, and that you can present its added value, and that's taken on. And so you're the creator of a system, and you're hoping that this movement will grow and that it will spread whatever it is that you intended it to do, and then some. So that's, again, a very different role. And I hear you say different things about how you think you fulfilled the role. And I think it's leading to change of changes to create a system rather than leading in a bigger system, like in a big corporation, or to be a coach, which is in the liminal space, as you expressed it. So thank you for sharing these three very distinct viewpoints of fulfilling a role, playing a role in or with a system. Yeah. And where I wanted to go next, before we go to still moving, so what's your take on how leaders lead change now in the corporate world? And what are things that contribute to change, success, or failure as you see it now?
Yeah, so when we say the corporate world, obviously with my work with organisations like the Church of England, government departments, so it's sort of like what I call the world of institutions.
Yeah,
not necessarily be profit making. But I think the key challenge on, it doesn't matter what industry I work with, what context, is disruption.
Yeah.
And the two things actually. One is disruption, i.e. the solutions of the past are no longer going to serve the future. When I started off in this field 30 years ago, you could often get a solution from the past and then, let's now apply it.
Yeah.
But disruptive, and we all know why there's massive disruption now in today's world, so I won't go into the detail of that. But new solutions, fresh solutions are needed in a world of the digital technology, social media, whatever it might be. So new solutions are not found through old routines. New solutions are not found through old routines. And that's a tough one, because corporate leaders are now noticing that to move to a new business model or to a new what, we've got to change the how. How we do this has got to be radically different to how we've done it in the past. So for example, a lot of my clients are doing the so-called, agile.
Much quoted in this summit, by the way.
But a lot of my clients are approaching agile through a non-agile way. So the irony is they are looking to a very, very different future, bringing in whatever it might be, scrums, sprints, all of this, wonderful methodologies about becoming more agile. And yet it's launched from the center. There's a risk committee around it. It has policy behind it. And you look at how they're doing it, you think, wow, they're using old routines to get to new places. So I think a lot of leaders are having to become what I call more conscious, more awake to how they go about change. Is it modeling the desired intention?
Right.
So I do believe disruption in today's world is not just about moving to a very different business model, but also the approach to change has to be disruptive as well. And that means becoming more conscious. And when I looked at change when I've led it, or other people, we don't often ask ourselves the question, how am I intentionally leading change? I know what I need to be doing, change of culture, new skills, whatever, but what kind of change approach will be most appropriate to get me to the new world? And how is that different to how we've led change in the past? And I guess through my writings and that, I'm quite well known for advocating a less programmatic, top-down approach to change, that assumes control and a central intelligence, to using the power of the whole system to bring the change in. So it's very, radically different approach to change.
And so what I'm curious about is then how do you introduce this to leaders? Suppose that a leader comes to you and says, okay, Deborah, we've been trying to deal with the disruption that we're experiencing with our organization or within the industry, and we know that we need to approach it differently, but we don't know how. Now what? So can you help us in making a shift? We know that as leaders we need to approach it differently, but how do we do that? So where do you start with them?
Where to start? It's always fateful, isn't it? As we know, a lot of systems people at this summit, beginnings are fateful. because in the beginning, you can almost predict the end.
Mm.
Now, given that most of the intentions are around being in command but not in control of today's world, opening up to system intelligence, pace, etc., I try to work with the clients to boil down what is the essence of that shift that's required for us.
Yeah.
And I tend to start small, Jennifer. And that might be how we run meetings around here. One of my great influences in this field academically has been Carl Weick from Michigan, I believe. I think from Michigan, the sense-making guy.
Yeah.
And he has talked about how meetings are fractals. They're like crucibles of the overall culture.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're trying to shift an organization's routines, start with the meetings, key meetings. So it could be the quarterly performance review meeting, it could be the annual senior leadership gathering, and start to experiment, to run them in ways that are not heavily predicted. You know, you've got the agenda all worked out in advance, you've got tons of pre-read, but to run them in ways that feel lighter, more open, more in the moment. So, and then you think, wow, that meeting felt different.
Yeah.
You know, we were able to say things in that meeting that we've never said before. Because we didn't have an agenda, we got the real issues out on the table. Because there was a pre-read, I came to this conversation with no prior opinion. Weren't we more creative in this meeting? So to sort of experiment where it feels relatively risk-free, to learn from that and think, gosh, okay, so how can we maybe amplify that process in that meeting and take it elsewhere? I'm sure a lot of people on this summit have worked, for example, with open space technology, which I learned way back when in my Shell days with the WISE boards and the founders of open space technology, or Harrison Owen originally. And just using that at a senior leadership conference, opening up 3 hours to what the room needed to talk about.
Yeah.
When that happened, the requests then my client got for, can we now use this in our business unit? Can we do that here? Because it really created new outcomes. So for me, it starts with boiling down the essence of your intention. What is the shift we're trying to make? And then perhaps going to relatively risk-free areas that don't require a lot of investment, tons of consultants to come in and bring in new processes, and to work from there.
Yeah. And so what I hear you say is that when you start small, it's about starting where the interaction is taking place, actually, because there's an intention, and then the meetings are usually the places where the important information gets shared. And as you were talking about meetings and shaping them differently, it reminded me of some of the remarks that we've had of fellow anthropologists earlier in previous summits, who talked about campfires and to take away all the structure, like you mentioned, and to really have people talk and connect about what's really important. And then they'll have a totally different experience of the meetings. And usually the meetings are more effective because we're not staring at a preset structure, but we are working with what's really on our minds and hearts. So yeah, starting small and starting with particular intention, and then having spaces where there's more generative, as I call it, interaction, is where you would start off with leaders.
Yes. I think the other area I would talk about as well is the leadership development processes. Because obviously leadership development, or should we say learning and change are so coexistent. So to bring in change into an organization, you have to look at how do we get our leaders ready for change? What are the new skills and capacities needed? And I'm also witnessing quite a questioning and new approaches in what I would call the traditional forms of leadership development that felt to be more taught, getting very erudite people along. And I'm asked sometimes, I'm not that I'm very erudite, but to come along and lecture or give a masterclass. And of course that still encourages dependency.
Yeah.
So work with more what I call experiential modes of leadership development.
Yeah.
So with one organization, we approach leadership development in a radically different way.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing, again, going back to just your change process model, the intention was all about, again, radical renewal, innovation, and getting used to uncertainty.
Yeah.
And the going in assumption to the leadership program was we need to work out the curriculum in advance. We need to give people all the pre-read. They need to know exactly what they're doing on day 3 of the program so they can schedule their conference calls. And we went in to design in its place leadership retreats that was very unstructured, very experiential, working within the moment learning.
Yeah. Yeah.
That also felt very, very different. Now, the challenge when you do this work is you then create what's called like a parallel universe. So the leadership development might feel incredibly, maybe a bit strange, but very, very powerful, having the conversations, as you say, that matter,
Mm-hmm.
or you're trying to change the meetings. But then people will say to you, but when I'm back at the office, or when I'm at work,
Yeah.
things don't feel quite the same way.
No, because they shifted context again. They're back to the old context. So that's that transition from how do you transition from the context where you've had a very different experience of how things could go, and how do you then bring that to your existing system that you work in every day. So yeah, could you speak more to that? How do you then guide that transition?
Yes, well, if there might be, as you said, more anthropologists either speaking or tuning in, I wrote an article recently that was all about lead like an anthropologist and lead change well. And I've heard it said that the task of an anthropologist is to make the familiar strange and the strange familiar. And when I read that book about anthropology, I felt, my goodness, that is exactly what great change leaders do. So let's unravel that. Making the strange familiar, all about, can you take new concepts and make them appear? Well, of course, we should always run our meetings like that. It felt really odd at the beginning, but now I've got used to it. I've done it a few times. We haven't fallen off the universe. And boy, it's now become the new norm.
Yeah.
Then can you make what's familiar strange? My goodness, look at our routines. Why do we do it like that? So I often use this juxtaposition of, can you make the familiar now strange, which in itself is a disruptive force as a change leader, and can you make what feels very strange, can you make it familiar? And I'm sure people might know that when was it Edison brought in electricity and the light bulbs, he brought in the new form of power.
Yeah.
And yet the casings were all designed as old-fashioned gas lamps, because he felt that if he put in the new light bulbs in a new fitting, people would get too scared.
Yeah.
So he made the strange familiar by using gas lamp surroundings to bring in a new form of energy. And I love that story, because to do this well, you can't be too weird. You're needing to bring in changes and new things in ways that people will still recognize in some way.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this example, because as I'm listening to you, what I'm noticing is that there is in this summit we've had different conversations about how to deal with difference, and change is all about that. How do we deal with something that is shifting and changing because it's different? And in some contexts, we say it's good when departments or different parts within an organization or a system need to work together, and they're not good at that, to look at the similarities. There's some who say it's important to stress the differences first, and then acknowledge each other, and then start working together. And then there's this third perspective that you're bringing in, where you're saying, why don't we make the familiar different or odd, and vice versa, so that there is more fluidity across that line of what are we used to and what is new, and to have an understanding of what is the transition process actually about, and what does it feel like once you move from one foot to the other, and back again. So thank you for this additional perspective. We haven't had that one yet. And how you see that as your role as from more an anthropological perspective on how you can facilitate change. Interesting. And we'll probably also look up the article and make it available for everyone who's watching. Where I want to go next is to your latest book. And it's a bit of a shift, speaking of changes. So it's called Still Moving. And I know that it's based on your research in terms of change leadership, amongst other things. And I'm wondering, why is it called Still Moving?
So I got intrigued by, I can't remember, it's on the front page of the book, which I don't have with me, by a Japanese master talking about the importance of being still and moving at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And what we found in the latest round of research, which was into, I know we'll get on to looking at the impact of mindfulness and systemic awareness in a leader's capacity to lead change well.
Yeah.
What we found was that movement, and I'll contrast that with what I call action.
Yeah.
Movement starts in stillness.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't start in becoming very, very busy.
Mm-hmm.
So by movement, I contrast it with action. So I describe action as the unconscious repetition of past routine. So, you know, I was talking earlier about an organization wanting to become agile.
Yeah.
Yet they were doing it in non-agile ways. So they were using old routines to get to new places. So we can get very busy and launch lots of stuff and get action. Movement is when you fundamentally change the source of your routines. You go to the source, as Otto Scharmer says. So you're looking at what is causing all of these patterns in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, we found that the leaders who are most successful at deeply reinventing and creating movement in their teams or in their organizations started with becoming still and giving attention to what's here now. Because if you're not still, you don't know what you're doing. You can't see yourself. So I got intrigued by putting still and moving together. They're opposite words.
Yeah.
To talk about that you need to have both to be an effective leader of change in today's world, both stillness and movement. They are like the two sides of the same coin. But of course, still also is an adverb.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Adjective.
Yeah.
It also implies sustainability. So still moving.
Yeah.
It's all about the ongoing nature of change in today's world. So the primary one, though, is about to create movement. All movement starts from a place of inner stillness.
Yeah. Yeah. And speaking of inner stillness and the mindfulness, I do want to read back to you a quote that I saw in a description of your book. And it says that the book is challenging leaders to cultivate both their inner and outer skills necessary for success. And so Still Moving weaves together the being and the doing of states of leading change and emphasizes the importance of a mindful stance and deep systemic perspective within a leader, unquote. And so let's start with the mindful stance first. What is that exactly? How would you describe that?
Yes, well, having just heard your description as well of the book, I have got a little visual here as well. That I remember I was giving a talk once, and I just got up one morning and got my acrylic crayons out.
Yeah.
And the inner still and the outer moving. So the blue is this inner set of capacities, and then the green is what you have to do as a change leader. But yes, let's start with with mindfulness. And in fact, the last round of research I did, I really wanted to test whether or not a leader's capacity for mindfulness, and I'll define it in a few seconds, allows them to be more effective at leading whole system change.
Yeah.
There'd been a lot of research done on individual benefits. It makes you calmer, more creative, increases working memory capacity or empathy, etc. But I was intrigued about, well, if our leaders in our institutions can become more mindful, will that lead to collective change outcomes that are different? And there hadn't been any research in the field done on that.
Yeah.
Now, I always I'm very I like things to be simple, or try to make them simple. But for me, mindfulness is the awareness, the increase in awareness that arises out of present moment attention.
Yeah.
The awareness that arises out of present moment attention.
Mm-hmm.
And it's done in a non-judgmental way. So I'm sure a lot of people at the summit are aware of that classic definition of mindfulness and why that's so powerful. One of the key inner capacities, the blue in the middle of still moving, was about becoming present to what is.
Yeah.
And in times of leading change, you can really get out of yourself in ways that are very troubling. Yeah. And I worked with a leader once. She was leading a major bank in the US. And it was under I won't describe all the detail, but very, very difficult, complex, high magnitude change, stirring up a lot of anxiety in the institution. And she was excellent at mindfulness in terms of becoming present to what was going on inside her. Yeah. And every morning when she got up, she had the shower, and in the mirror, when you shower, sometimes it gets all steamed up, which sometimes is quite useful. She didn't have a great night's sleep, but she would draw emojis in her mirror as to how was she feeling right now. How was she feeling right now? And whatever that feeling was, she would draw it on the steam of her mirror. This was the CEO of a major, US bank. Yeah. And the moment she was able to tune into, her emotion, give it a place, it lost its grip on her. Yeah, yeah. So why is the capacity to be able to tune into and to recognize your inner state so important to being able to change the outer world around you? This was the fascinating thing, that the more you can regulate your inner mental and emotional response to experience, you can then change the emotional and mental response of the people around you. I find that absolutely fascinating, and it was a slam dunk in the research. Yeah, yeah. The first thing it allows you to do as a change leader is to, in fact, somebody at a conference recently said, I've got my 3 Ps that I always use. I said, what are your 3 Ps? And her 3 Ps were pause, permits, perspective. And I love that. When you pause, you start to notice things differently. You're not so caught up in them. Yeah. So pause, permits, perspective. And what it enabled leaders do, when you're more mindful as to what's going on for you and where might that come from, you are then able to tune into the system around you in a very, very different way. Yeah. And I call it, it's being able to tune into the system free of your story. Yeah, yeah. And I'll give a bit of a personal example about this. I know we started at the beginning with my archaeology and anthropology. I think people who might have read the book or followed some of my writing know that I'm an adopted child. Okay. So the first sentence of my book is, my life began in change. Yeah. And I always go way back when to that very early formative experience. So at a very, very early age, I was in out of control, unknown territory. Yeah. And the consequence of that, when I then became a leader, as an adopted child myself, I learned to feel secure by pleasing everybody. Yeah. That was how I responded. Yeah. Yeah. People, and to also be perfect. So my 2 Ps are always being perfect and pleasing others. And that for me was my security ticket into never being rejected again. Yeah. To feel I could be secure and to belong. Now, obviously, when you're leading change, to be able to be perfect all the time and please people ain't going to work. So I had to do a lot of work on my own story to make sure that I didn't project that story then onto the system that I'm either advising or when I was in the leadership roles as well. Yeah. And because I knew my own story so well and where my impulses came from, I was then able to more cleanly recognize what was going on around me. Yeah. And I call it free of your own story.
Yeah.
So whenever we do work developing leaders to lead change well, it's essential that you start with knowing your story and where your default routines come from.
Yeah.
You know, on autopilot and under stress, which is what change is, we will default to our past coping patterns, and they're not always helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now,
Thank
when
you for
leaders
sharing that one. I'm just going to pause you there for a second, because I so resonate with what you're saying, and it has to do with it's like that balance between taking care of yourself, because that's what you're actually doing. When you share the example of the CEO who is drawing smileys, to then make sure, am I tuned into myself and I'm not sort of taken hostage by my own emotions? And it's also about, in doing that, you're actually disrupting yourself, because you're disrupting your own coping mechanisms and survival mechanisms that you're used to doing when you're under a lot of stress. And these self-regulating things, as I call them, are very important, are very core of what you call the practice of mindfulness, right?
That's really important what you said, Jennifer, because unless a leader at the individual level can regulate their own routines, they're not going to be able to regulate the organization's routines.
Right.
Because in a way, an organization, like I was saying earlier, has its coping mechanisms. It has its own story.
Yes.
Why finding out the organization's origin story, not just you as an individual leader, is so fundamental, because then the routines that you see how the organization survives and copes today is a consequence of some of that past. And it has served this organization extraordinarily well.
Yeah.
So for me, the fascinating thing then is looking at how do you move from the individual leader's capacity to self-regulate and to learn new routines. How do you make that a collective skill?
Yeah, exactly.
That's a very important question.
Yeah. And so in that sort of movement from the individual to the collective, is that where the deep systemic perception comes in, that is also part of this balance between the inner and the outer game?
Yes, very much so. And I know that a lot of people, again, tuning into the summit, might work with techniques like constellations or systemic constellations.
Yeah, some do, yeah.
And I remember going back to leadership development, we worked with one organization once over a 3-year period.
Mm-hmm.
We were going through massive disruption, having to completely reinvent their business model. And we worked with the top 360 leaders over 10 waves of 36 leaders. This was a massive collective exercise in noticing your routines and trying to shift them at the collective level.
Mm-hmm.
And on every one of these waves, we worked with mapping the system. So we worked with mapping out all of the elements: the regulator, politicians, the media, the supervisory board, the unions, the different business units, innovation, new competitors, to really try and map all of those elements in a non-cognitive way in a room. Now, the leaders have never done anything before in their life like this. What it enabled them to do was to start to see that we are holding collective patterns here in our response to the disruption. Some of which is helpful, some of which is less helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So the task became one of trying to collectively, and then after every one of these waves, what we noticed through time was that that fractal of the organization was holding a different systemic response in the change. So we started to publish the results of each one of these systemic maps or constellations through time. Mm-hmm. In a way, it was not, I'm quite saying, like Manfred Kitz-de-Vries in Seattle, like corporate therapy, but it took the level of individual acknowledgement to my impulses and where they come from, can I shift those routines, to a very, very significant collective level. So the key thing here about tuning into the system is, can you help an organization see itself? Can you increase that level of awareness? The other thing that I have found extraordinarily helpful to disrupt collective routines through becoming more mindful is, and I know again this is lots of people do this, so I'm not claiming this is unique, is by going to the outside world.
Yeah.
Leave your institution and go to visit contexts in the world that in some way are already modeling the future that you're trying to get to yourself.
Yeah.
And we call them foraging. These groups of leaders went out to forage in new different contexts. The fascinating thing, and people might want to look at the overview effect film. If you Google overview effect in Google, I think it was Apollo mission 10, and they studied that.
Yeah.
And when they left to go to the moon, they thought, oh my goodness, we're going to now go and see, something completely different to what we know. The biggest impact it had on people was when they were on the moon looking back at Earth.
Yeah.
So by leaving their world, they saw their world in a very, very different way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in fact, the knowledge was not about the moon. The knowledge was about the planet, the Earth that we all inhabit.
Yeah.
So I find it fascinating in the corporate context that you've talked about. How can you get groups of leaders going out?
Yeah.
And it's wonderful. It's like being a tourist. I'm here at the moment in South Africa. When you leave your context, you look at your own context in very, very different ways. And you think, my goodness, why do we do it like that?
Yeah.
Going back to making the familiar strange. So I'm fascinated in what I would call, collective systemic mindfulness, not just the level of the individual.
Yeah.
So I could talk about this with examples for a long time, and you might be wanting to get on to other questions, but what we found in the research is that this capacity for awareness and improved consciousness allows you to not just notice your routine, but to also then disrupt your routines.
Yeah. 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 And so thank you for these examples, because it's very clear that when we talk about still moving, it's about the inner journey and disrupting yourself and disrupting your own patterns. It's about using deep systemic awareness and having the courage to get back to that word again, to step into a systemic view of your organization and collecting the maps and the narratives and the different systemic knowledge and gathering that and comparing them in time and everything else to have a very deep sense of what the system is about and how it moves. And then also to go to the biggest system around that, and that is the context outside of the organization, to only discover that there's a lot of value in looking from the outside back into the system and allowing the system to see itself if it's a group of leaders looking at their own organization from the outside. And so is that what the still moving practice, as I would call it, is that what it looks like, to look at these different levels of looking at the system internally, organization, context, is what the practice is about, or are there other aspects as well?
Yes, there are other aspects. So we've talked so far about maybe more the blue bit, this inner world, the capacity to know yourself in order to regulate yourself and to use that to tune into the system and help the system notice its routines.
Yeah.
But you also have to do stuff, right? You have to, there's results, there's processes that need changing, et cetera, in a transformation process as well. So what we found, what most successful change leaders have to do in action was what we call bring edge and tension into an organization. So one of the messages we use is make disturbance your friend. And often we're talking about difference earlier. How can we work with difference? Well, how can we work with disturbance? And to actually use it as a transformative energy rather than a dysfunctional or a destructive energy. And what this means in practice, edge and tension, the primary doing skill of a leader is talking straight, being able to name reality unambiguously, truthfully, with compassion, but with truth. And maybe it's just the culture I've been brought up in, but sometimes it's extraordinarily difficult for leaders to talk about, I think it was called the brutal facts in the book.
Yeah.
good to great.
Mm.
And as we were preparing for this, interestingly, you and I were talking about that amazing TV series, Chernobyl.
Mm-hmm.
And I've only just caught up and watched the 5 episodes, but
Yeah.
it's an extraordinary way of looking at how the denial of truth or the negating of open speaking in organizations can lead to, in this case, obviously a tragic disaster. But the same things happen in corporate contexts as well.
Yeah.
When we can only talk about good news.
Yeah, exactly. It so reminds me of working with a group of executives a couple of months ago who really wanted to get a change done, and the way they were embarking on the change, I invited them to do it slightly differently and to really speak with these about the facts and about being really honest about it. And it was very difficult for them. It was very difficult for them to step their toes in, to put their toes in, and to really do it like that, because it's so not part of their and the organization's narrative and the way of doing things. But they also understood what the impact was of not doing that. And so they're very much on that, you say, look into the edge of things. They're very much on the edge for themselves as leaders. Are we going to embark on this journey or not? Are we going to approach change differently or not? And the interesting thing is the impact is the biggest once they decide to actually go there and cross that edge. But it's not easy. So as we're talking about it, I don't want anyone who's watching to think this is an easy process, because it's not. Because there's all these projections and connotations around what a leader should be doing, and what the leadership role is all about. And if you start transitioning in disrupting yourself and welcoming disruption in the organization, the context around it, then it's disruptive for everyone else in terms of how they see your role also.
I'm glad you said that, Jennifer, because it brings in, for me, the word responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
And going back to what I was saying earlier about the mission that we have around more effortless change, is it also responsible?
Yeah.
So you don't just do change for change's sake. It does impact people's lives. So I think, you're almost talking here about that pause point before we really go for this. Are we aware of what I call the price of change, not just the prize? And just by changing the Z to a C.
Mm-hmm.
So I have, and I see it's a natural tendency, we overestimate the prize of the change. Oh, it will become this, we'll do that, we'll become quicker, faster, whatever. But all big change comes with a cost. There's a price attached to it. Be that, as you're talking about the individuals you are working with, I'm going to have to break some loyalties to maybe a belief I have, or colleagues or whatever. And that feels scary and that feels difficult to do. But what I found is that if you can name the price at the same time as you talk about the prize, it allows people to step over what I call that Rubicon. Because then you go into it with full awareness that this is going to cost us something. Truth telling costs. It can really cost. It has a big prize associated with it, because it always brings flow and movement and relief when truth is talked about, but it comes with a consequence. So I find it's important to do both what I call price work as well as prize work when you're leading change. And leaders who could have this skill of what we call edge and tension, talking straight, were able to do that. And one of the reasons why they could do that, Jennifer, and that's why these inner capacities are so important, is once you've got the mindfulness and the systemic inner world, difficulty is never personalized. You don't blame people. You don't blame yourself. You give it a systemic interpretation. You acknowledge the wholeness of life and difficulty. And I find that, again, that helps build people then get the courage to do something scary and new and different, there will be consequences. You might upset that person there, but systemically, that's okay. It's not you being a bad person or them being a bad person either. So when you combine the systemic with the capacities to be straight, be courageous, you're then not seen to be a bully or somebody who's, trying to do heroic stuff.
Yeah. And that's where I tie in that responsibility, taking responsibility in a leadership role or in any role actually means that what you're doing and the action you're then taking after you paused have to do with serving the system and not with the personal. Because if you take difficulty personally, then usually there is a personal interest or aspect to it. But if you take a systemic perspective, then there's role and function, and it's obvious that the action you're taking is that you're trying to do something in the interest of the system at large. So speaking of responsibility, so thank you for speaking to that. We're almost closing off a conversation, and there are a few more things I want to ask you before we actually do. And one is, we covered a lot of ground together, Deborah, in this conversation. And I would want to ask you, for everyone who's watching and heard us speak, if there was a core, an essence of all that we've exchanged around change leadership, and still moving, then what is the essence or the one thing that you would like people to take away from this conversation?
To stop, notice your routines, look kindly on those routines, and to have the courage to start modeling what your true intention is for the future. So become less busy, more still, see what's there, know whether that's about you or whether it's about the system, and use that deep wisdom to bring in more responsible change. That would be, I guess, it's a tough question to boil it down, but that would be my, the movement starts in stillness, I think, for me, is the biggest message.
Yeah, and so there's an invitation to everyone who's watching to follow the movement that starts with stillness. And speaking of still and moving, I'm wondering also, how about you? And that's my last question, because you've been leading change in big organizations. You've founded your own consulting firm. You've done research. You work as a coach. What's your next movement once you are beyond the stillness?
For me personally, well, funnily enough, only this week I've been having conversations with somebody who sparked my interest in some future research, which for me felt very important.
Yeah.
And the one word that this person and I came up with was wholeness.
Wholeness. Yeah.
And to do some research, going back to difference and difficulty, around how, if we can learn to work from more, or to see the world from a unitive perspective rather than a fractured, fragmented perspective, how would that enable either leaders to do personal things in their life differently, with their teams, with their organizations, and with societies. So watch this space. I said I was not going to do any more research, but this person talked about this and said, look, I've got this organization, would love to do some interviews. How about it, Deb? So I'm hooked. So space, but and we actually found that one of the key inner capacities beyond the systemic awareness was what we call acknowledge the whole. And I do believe that will bring the world, and certainly with my work with the church, or a more faith-led organization, that to be able to embrace the wholeness of life, its pain, as well as its joy, its sadness, and its happiness, just leads to far more gracious living and less health issues. So maybe I'm getting a bit too spiritual in my old age, but that's where I'd like to go, Jennifer.
Yeah. It's a wholeness. I think it's a great note to end on. And Deborah, we've been talking about your change leadership lessons and what you've seen works and does not work when you want to be successful in it. And that when you look at leaders today and the challenges they face today, that there's a calling forth of taking more responsibility, of doing the inner work and standing still, stopping, pausing first, and then see what's the edge I can cross, what's the disruption I can meet, what is the habits that I can maybe break or change, and how can I bring that process into the larger systems around me, the organization I serve, but also looking at it from the outside in. So we looked at Still Moving, which has the mindful component and the deep systemic approach. And we heard from you in your process and how you shape different roles, and that wholeness is the essence of where you're moving next. So, yeah, I feel invited to be still after this conversation, to be silent, but not before I thank you for a very profound conversation. Thank you so much for being here in the summit with us, Deborah.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's been a real pleasure. And I've learned some stuff through the process too. And I hope it's going to serve the summit's participants.
I'm sure it will, and it has. And so to everyone who's watching, I would like to invite you to go to our online community space and share. But maybe before you do, you need to pause first and then engage with others to see what you found after your pause. Thank you so much for watching. Take care. See you next session. Bye-bye.